just a short video to talk you through the Geography NEA. I suppose you could use this video in one of two ways. Firstly, if you haven't thought about your NEA yet and you're yet to start, this is just some brief guidance about things that you might wish to consider at each of the 4 sections or 4 areas and sort of a little bit of help getting started. Secondly, if you've already written your NEA or in the process of writing your NEA, I would use this video almost as a checklist and as a starting point of what it is you've perhaps got left to cover or what you've omitted so far. I'm a current NEA examiner, and so what advice I give you here, I suppose, is come from everything that I've learned over marking and moderating NEAs for the last few years. The links that are at the bottom of the screen here I'll also put in the description, but are links to not my own resources, but other resources that are out there that I think are particularly very useful when thinking about your NEA. AQA has produced some really helpful information, most of which is on their website, detailing down the marking criteria and sort of good starting points and places you could look for resources. Field Studies Council has got some brilliant guidance on how to sort of start the planning phases, sort of possible ideas for titles or areas you may wish to look into. Likewise, Royal Geographical Society has got a sort of slightly simplified down proposal form and planning process, which is really useful, particularly in the run up to submitting your proposal. And of course, there's plenty of exemplars and things out there on the AQA website. Perhaps one of the most popular ones is the perfect example they've got on gentrification. Just be wary though, obviously, when you're using things like that you obviously can't copy from them because that'd be plagiarism. But it sort of shows you what the NEA looks like in practice. One website that I've just missed off this list, which I will pop in the bit down below, is the Island Geographer. Island Geographer again has got some brilliant resources in terms of common traps that students fall into, help with sort of statistical tests and things like that, which are really useful in Area 3, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So I suppose the big starting point then, and this really isn't relevant if you've already started, so feel free to skip ahead, but is to think about how you're going to go about setting the title for your NEA. Your title for your NEA obviously needs to be quite unique to your own investigation. It can't be the same as anybody else's, ideally. It's got to be something you're really interested in. I suppose there's like 4 factors for me when I consider a title to a fieldwork investigation that I think is really useful. Most important factor I'd say to start with is enjoyment. I think considering the amount of time you're going to put into your NEA, how long you're going to do this over, the fact you've got to independently research it yourself and conduct your own fieldwork, there's absolutely no point doing an investigation into something that you know you're highly likely not to enjoy. I myself am a human geographer, so it's more likely that I'm going to choose a human project because that's what I'm interested in. So for me, topics like water and carbon, whilst they're interesting, aren't really where my true passion is. So I would sort of play more to my strengths, I think, and lean towards a human geography project. The sort of joint, most equal important factor is it also has to be on the AQA specification. One trap that candidates fall into quite a lot of the time is to choose a project that is linked to rivers or is rivers based. Unfortunately, rivers isn't on the AQA A-Level specification, so avoid that one like the plague. It might be a good idea to read through the specification in advance, you know what's on there. You can obviously do an NEA linked to other topics that you haven't studied as long as it's on the specification. So biologists, for example, may well wish to focus perhaps on something ecosystems related in the ecosystems under stress unit that's not necessarily perhaps something they've been taught in school. Think about the scope of your project as well. You're not after a dissertation, it doesn't need to be a thesis, so think about how broad you're making your study and your inquiry. The most popular ones are when people try and do change over an area, so change over Reading. Well, Reading is a massive area in itself, so that's going to be really hard to do. So narrow it down, pick 2 areas perhaps within that. So maybe a comparative study between local places like Calcott and Tilehurst or Calcott and Early would be more appropriate than trying to cover the whole of Reading. It's a bit like saying I'm going to measure inequality across the whole of London. Unless you're sort of doing a PhD, it's not really possible. Think about locality as well as the other thing to say. This is going to be somewhere you can get to go and collect your fieldwork data. So if you can't get there, and you know you're probably not going to go there, then there's no point starting out the investigation. So some people say, oh yeah, I'm going to go look at this when I'm in Tenerife or when I'm on holiday. Okay, but are you actually going there? Have you booked your plane tickets yet? Like, do you physically know you're going to that place to be able to collect that data? 9 times out of 10, it's no. So I would avoid that like the plague and just go for somewhere that you can get to. Projects that are based in your local area that are easy for you to get to and are something that you see on almost on a daily basis are sometimes the ones where candidates perform their very best. So I suppose in short the advice is, do you enjoy it? Is it on the spec? How much scope has this project got? Can you get there? Are like the 4 easy, simple questions you need to ask yourself when you're starting to think about what your investigation theme wants to be. You don't need to come up with a title straight away, but the theme, the sort of core grounds of your project, needs to sort of be grounded in each of these 4 areas, I would suggest. So once you have that and you've submitted your proposal you probably have all seen, but again, you get a copy of that off the AQA website. I'm not going to show it here because of copyright, unfortunately. But work your way through those boxes, fairly self-explanatory. As I said to you, RGS has got some fab resources to help with planning. You then make your way into Area 1 once you're approved. Area 1 is like you setting the scene for your investigation and for your project. So ideally, here's a checklist of everything that you should have within Area 1. So the most obvious one would be to say, have you written your title at the top of the page? Have you got aims, sub-questions, hypotheses? Are they clear and visible? You do not need all 3 of those. So here is another trap that candidates fall into. They will have a set of aims and they'll also have hypotheses, or they'll have some sub-questions, hypotheses. Just stick with one really clear set that when you come back to it in Area 4, you can argue for and against and generate an overall conclusion. It muddies the waters if you've got an aim, a hypothesis, sub-question, and then you're trying to conclude. Because as an examiner, you're then thinking, well, what are they concluding in Area 4? I'm not really clear on that. Here in Area 1, I would always put my aims as sort of subtitles and I would discuss each one. I'm going to link back to the specification. I'm going to tell the examiner exactly where they can find it. Notice on my example here, I've already specified the exact point that they should look for it. Think about how and why your NEA should be in that part of the specification and nowhere else. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Your literature review here is again another crucial part of your NEA. It's basically saying, you know what other geographers are out there saying about similar themes that you are researching and how that has influenced your study. Again, I'll show you how to do that. Geographical theory is another important thing here. The amount of candidates, for example, that will do a project on urban heat island and will do some beautiful literature on urban heat island, won't actually talk about the theory of it and what an urban heat island is quite astounding. So make sure, I will probably put this above my literature review in my NEA, that you've got a diagram perhaps or an explanation referenced, of course, about exactly what these key theories are and what these key concepts are so that you can properly embed them within your investigation. Likewise, show off the area that you're going to. So maps at different scales are really relevant, and perhaps a brief risk assessment depends on the type of field work you're sort of undertaking. So I'll sort of talk through these in a little bit more detail. Again, if you're doing this as you follow along with it, perhaps writing your Area 1, you might want to stop and keep sort of pausing and playing every time you've completed one of these jobs. So as we said, sort of job 1 really then is to have your overall title stated clearly. I would suggest that you do this in 2 ways. 1, that you have a clear title page. 2, you put the title at the top of the page, the very first page that you're going to write on. Think about the way it's written. Think about grammatical mistakes. Does it need the question mark, for example? Is it in an appropriate font? I would suggest that your font size should be about size 11, 12. Don't go whacking in whopping great font in sort of size 16, 18 for your whole NEA. Think about this as a professional piece of work that you are submitting that's worth 20% of your A-level. Once you've put your overall title down, the next thing we should see bullet pointed underneath are your aims, your sub-questions, your hypotheses, whichever one of the 3 you're going with. I would then use those as subtitles and underneath each one discuss exactly why I'm doing it. Why is this going to answer my title? So for example, if I'm doing some sort of sustainability based NEA, well, why, for example, have I got a sub-question that's looking at social, economic and environmental sustainability? Why is that going to help me reach a balanced conclusion to answer my overall title? After which then, it's your link to the specification. So again, this is the point now where I'd log into AQA, I'd pull up their specification and I'd find the exact point. Some people will just say, oh, okay, well, it's in Unit 1, it's in Unit 2, but where exactly? So if you look at my one down here, I'm saying I've got an NEA about farming practices and their impact on the water cycle. So I'm going to say this links with section 3.1.1 and 3.1.1.2 in my NEA. So I might write this in my NEA something along the lines of, this NEA links to this section as I must identify the key components of the water cycle before I can then apply this knowledge to examining the impact of farming practices in 3.1.1.2. That's me firstly saying this is where it is in the spec, and that's then my justification for why I'm linking it there, and that's what the examiner is also really interested in. Feel free to pause if you want to use that example. Literature review then sort of builds on this a little bit. Essentially here you're being awarded marks for how well you look at relevant literature and how well you link it to your study. So websites such as Google Scholar should really become your new best friend. Examinees, think about, right, okay, what's this geographer saying about similar sort of themes? Firstly, is it relevant to your study? If it's not, don't write about it. But if in some way it is linked, so it's a similar location, it's a similar theme, but they've done it in another town, it's a similar sort of way of measuring the same sort of thing that you want to do, then I'd argue it's relevant. The best sort of marks and the best literature reviews don't just look at sources in isolation. They say, okay, here's what one geographer's saying, that's a bit similar to what somebody else is saying, but that disagrees with what this person is saying. And it's written up almost a little bit like a 20 marker style paragraph and saying, well, this person agrees, this person doesn't agree. Overall, what are the sort of consensus here? So you'll see here on the screen, for example, when I'm looking at regeneration and I'm talking about place meaning, I've sort of drawn on ideas from Ralph and Massey, two fantastic geographers, by the way, that are really useful in human geography NEAs. And I've said, right, okay, well, Ralph's putting forward this idea that space and place has got contested meanings. That's shared by Massey. Massey said that globalisation is responsible for shaping local place. Okay, why is that interesting now? Why is that relevant to my study? Well, therefore, in my NEA, I'm going to conduct a clone town survey to determine if places is also a concern. I'm also going to do X, Y, and Z. So I'm saying, here's what the geographers have said, here's why it's really relevant, here's what I'm doing with this information. That's the sort of sign of a really good literature review. You might want to do this as sort of 2 or 3 paragraphs worth and consider sort of a few geographers. I would sort of say 4, maybe 5 sources, absolute maximum. It's about getting the absolute gold dust from them and not just taking their name and putting a sentence and a quote in. That's not a literature review. Anybody can quote somebody. It's what you do with that information here that's getting you the marks. Geographical theories and models, as we hinted on at the start of this section. Again, think about what it is you're studying. Have you told us what the geography is, where the geographies come from? Think about what you're doing. If you're talking about sand dunes, have you got a succession model in there? If you're talking about urban heat islands, have you got a little diagram, how you measure it, what's it about? If you're talking about sustainability, have you talked about the Egan wheel, for example? That's what I mean by geographical theory or model here. And to sort of round up and finish off area 1, have you got maps at different scales? For example, if I'm focusing on Reading, have I got a map of the UK? Have I got a map of the South? Then I would zoom into Reading. I would sort of say 3 is pretty good. Make sure you're referencing stuff. Even if you've borrowed it from our friend Google, it must be really, really clear where you've got that from. Unless you've drawn it by hand, someone else has produced it and therefore you need to reference it. Again, think about the risks of you going on field work. Have you risk assessed this? Have you thought it through? A brief risk assessment is sort of good practice within geography, and it might be good practice for you to show this within your NEA as well. Think about what the hazard is itself, think about who's at risk, what its current risk factor is, what could you do to try and make this risk any better. Right, now if I do all of those things, how risky is it? That's what I would suggest you go with. And so the table at the bottom is obviously there for you to borrow and for you to adapt for your NEA. But I would suggest sort of 4 to 5 risks. So if I'm a human geographer and I'm conducting some field work in the town centre, for example, I might say, well, one hazard is traffic. The person at risk is going to be me. If it's quite busy and I've got to try and cross the road and there's no crossing, okay, risk factor, high to medium. What can I do to minimise the risk? Always cross at specified crossings, look left and right before I cross. Make sure that I stay on the path, especially along busy roads, for example. Okay, my new risk factor, medium to low, providing I follow those guidelines. That's what I mean by an effective risk assessment. So at the end of all this then, area 1's complete. So we now move into area 2. Area 2 is all about your methods and how you're going to collect this data. A slightly shorter to-do list here, but more to write in each of these tiny little areas. So essentially here, map of sites. So you might have done a map of location now, but map of sites is something else that needs to be added in. How are you going to sample this data? What techniques are you using? Why are you going to do it this way? Are there any limitations? And then if you're about to set out and collect data, it's good practice here now to pop in a copy of your data collection sheets to show exactly what you're recording that data on. So a detailed map of sites, for example, is really useful to show the moderator or the examiner exactly where you've got this data from. So for example, if I say I'm looking into inequality across an area, I might have a transect that goes right the way through the city centre, and I might plot on stops 1 to 20 or 1 to 30 where I'm going to collect that data. Underneath this map, I might then justify and say, well, okay, I'm doing these stops 1 to 20 because at stop 1 there's this, at stop 2 there is this, 3, 4, etc. And I'm justifying why I'm choosing each of those stops. That links really nicely into the types of sampling which you'll need to draw on here. It's not just enough to say I'm going to this place because I feel like it. I'm going to this place because I think I can get the good data there. Why? So think about it, justify it. Random sampling is like saying, right, I'm just going to pick names out of a hat and roll with it. Systematic sampling, you might choose an interval. So if you're going to do a questionnaire, for example, on a busy high street, you might say, I'm just going to pick every third person that walks past me here and ask them my questionnaire. Stratified sampling is when you've got some parameters. So you might say, okay, well, I'm interested in the impacts of crime on people in this area, in this postcode, and 40% of people living in this area are women, so therefore 40% of my respondents in my survey I'd also like to be women, so it's reflective. Remember that within your NEA, you're not just going to stick to one of these types of samplings. You're going to choose multiple and you're going to justify exactly why you've done that. Some of these types of sampling will better fit with your investigation or better fit with your methodology than others. Think about your sample size as well. Too small a sample size and you're not going to have enough data. Too large a sample size and you're just going to have too much data to actually do anything with it. I would suggest if you're doing a questionnaire for an NEA, you're going to want somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 responses. I would suggest if you're doing a transect, you're going to want somewhere in the region of sort of 20 to 30 stops across an area, obviously depending on size. You might choose to use quadrants, for example. They're another really good technique. You might try and do it so it's sort of proportional to size of population. So if you're doing something on SUDS potentially on a new housing estate, you might sort of divvy that up and try and visit sort of 20 to 30% of the area to make it a bit more representative rather than just sort of 1 or 2 sites. Again, the most important thing, notice I've put it in bold here at the bottom, is at every step of your process and every step of your thinking, be prepared to justify exactly why you've made these choices. It's the justification here that earns you the marks in your final marking. So once you've decided all that, you've decided what you're going to do, you're now on to collecting your data. So independence is key here really. Notice the title, it's called Independent Investigation. So they're looking for you to go out and get this data, ideally on your own, but remember you can go with a group and think, right, what's really key here? What am I getting? Okay, make sure you reference your data in your written report. If you're collecting your primary data, make sure you keep absolutely everything logged. Okay, if you're collecting secondary data, think about its purpose. Why do you want it? Are there any errors to it? I would try and avoid collecting secondary data from websites like Wikipedia, for example. They're normally biased to start with, so just think really carefully about where you're drawing that from. Academic journals or like newspaper articles for differing opinions and things like that are absolutely fine as well. I would always suggest to you, and this is like a big mistake people make when you're writing a proposal, a good idea is to say to yourself, right, does the secondary data already exist? Like, there's no point starting this investigation if it doesn't. And people will find loads of great articles, loads of great sources, and then don't save the links to them. So either put the links to your secondary sources on your proposal or have another document open where you save these and you can go back to them. On the screen here, you'll see I've put some like good suggestions here of secondary sources you may wish to go back to use to support your work. Police and crime statistics, actually, their website's had a really good update recently and it's pretty useful at the moment. Census data is like a black hole people fall down into. Just check census data exists, especially if we're doing a pocket within an area, that it's specific enough and enables you to drill down into that data as well. Towards the back end of area 2 then, you're going to evaluate these. You're going to say, here's what's a strength, here's what's a weakness of quantitative and qualitative techniques. I won't read these to you, so feel free to pause if you need to, but here's just sort of some generic ideas there. Think about the way that you designed things. Think about the way that you're enabling yourself to collect data. Think about ethical considerations as part of this as well. I mean, if you're going out and taking photographs, should you be really photographing people's houses? Should you have people's faces in them? Think about the sorts of people you're asking as well. Like, do you need to collect any personal information on your questionnaire? The answer is always going to be no. But think about those sorts of considerations as well, please. And so when you write it up in area 2, you may choose to go with a table. I think a table is the best way and sort of helps me to think about my methods. You can, of course, write it up as paragraphs, but I think popping it all in the table might be slightly easier. So for area 2, I could just present this underneath my map of sites. So I'd say, right, here's all my techniques in the first column. I might choose to have a key here and highlight them according to primary and secondary data. Why am I using this? How am I doing? Spell that method out like I've never collected data before. How do you do a questionnaire? Justification of your sampling, so which method of sampling you're using, why are you using that one, what sort of problems and limitations, so evaluate it. And then say, okay, well, if I was doing this again, what improvements do I need to make? Now's also a really good time to mention that you could do a pilot study if you want to. So some people might take a questionnaire, go to an area and trial it on a few people first and see the sorts of data they're getting before they go ahead and collect 30. You could write this up here in your area 2 and say, well, look, I've experimented with my questionnaire. This was the original design I had. I found it didn't really give me the in-depth data I needed to answer my third sub-question, so I've tweaked questions 4 and 5, which are now this, and this is the questionnaire I'm going to go forward and use in my study. That's also perfectly fine to do. Pop in underneath your table any sort of blank copies of data collection sheets you're going to use so the examiner can see exactly how you've recorded your data. And that's area 2 done. You're off to collect your data. So to come back to area 3 then, you've got to have collected all of your data. So a good idea would be to say I'm going to do areas 1 and 2 before the summer holidays. Over the summer holidays, I'm going to collect all my data and I'm going to come back in ready to crack on with area 3. Area 3 can be a bit of a slog, and so organisation really is the key here, I think, with this chapter to the NEA. I would always back up my data into a document. If I've done it on sort of pieces of paper, I'd scan them all in so I've got an electronic copy just in case worst comes to the worst. Likewise, if you've done it all electronically, I would dump it all in one sort of Excel document or Google Sheet or something of that ilk. So again, I've got it to draw on. Good practice is obviously to include a copy of your data in the appendix of your NEA as well. So once you've got your data, think about what graphs you're going to use, and the next sort of points follow on from that really. You've got to present it, you've got to explain it for both your primary and secondary data, try and link the two together, and then pull them back and say, oh, how do they relate to my theory? Does it sort of prove or disprove what I said in my literature? Right, overall here, what are my strengths and weaknesses? So if I look at this in a bit more detail, I'm basically going to say, right, what techniques am I using? It's not enough here to do what I call death by pie chart. Some candidates will just fall into this trap and do loads and loads of pie charts, and I've done a questionnaire with 10 questions on it. Here's 10 pie charts. Every piece of data you collect must be presented, but the examiner is looking for a variety of techniques, also looking for you to show off a degree of difficulty with these techniques. So geospatial techniques like using ArcGIS if you've got a copy of that, or Digimaps to present your data. Overlaying it onto maps is another good way. Combining 2 sets of data into one graph is another great way. Can you do a stats test? I mean, the obvious one is to say that if you can use a stats test and you don't, and there's a really obvious opportunity for it, you will get marked down. So that's why websites like the Island Geographer and the guidance they provide are really, really useful. What I mean by an obvious opportunity for a statistical test is to say, if you're investigating the relationship between something and you don't look at obvious opportunities like Spearman's rank, for example, you will be marked down. Try and sort of interrogate your data as well. Use things that serve a purpose. Don't quote that result without understanding what it means in the context of your investigation. So it's not enough to say, okay, well, I think 50% of people are saying that, right, yeah, overall, yeah, I can prove that. Well, you can't. Only 50% of people have said that. So what are the other 50% of people saying, for example? That would be something I would be asking myself as an examiner here. So don't go making big, bold claims. The amount of people that will make claims and say, yep, on my one day in July, I walked across Reading, yep, the temperature was high, yes, Reading has an urban heat island. Well, does it? Did it have an urban heat island on that day? Was it just the east side of Reading that had an urban heat island? Think really carefully about the sort of size and scope of the claim that you're going to make as well in your analysis. Think about then why you've chosen these data presentation techniques. This is another thing you'll need to justify. So if you've chosen to use Spearman's rank, or why have you done that? You've chosen it because you want to see the relationship between something, or if there is a relationship, or the degree to which there is a significance between two sets of data, for example. That would be an appropriate explanation. To try and link back to your data and your theory all the time. Okay, so in my literature review, they said I was going to see this. Does my data show me that? Why? How do I know that? Quote some data, manipulate that data. I would almost be tempted to treat the data analysis like you're writing up a 6-mark exam question all the time. What have I got there? Are there facts? Is there a trend? Can I manipulate the data? Are there any anomalies? Is there anything I didn't expect to see there? Can I explain that away or not? If you can't, it's fine, but draw the examiner's attention to it. You don't know why that's happened. So would you be wise to keep using that data? You may choose to omit anomalies from your study. If you're keeping them in, again, be prepared to justify that. Think about the academics that you talked about at the start. Just go back to their overall big arching claims. Do you roughly sit in line with them? Does your study disagree? If you had collected more data, for example, would you need more evidence to prove it or disprove it? Those are all things to mention here and in Area 4, so it's worth going back to them. I think before I start my Area 3, my big tip would be go back, read my literature review and just bullet point what people are saying. Like, what are the big claims we're making in my literature review? Just have a quick glance through my data, right, what supports what? Is there any evidence of that? And that's what you draw back to. Sometimes there'll be like an overlink between one piece of the literature review and not everything else. And what I mean by that is some candidates will say, yep, my literature review said I'm definitely going to see this, and yep, in every single graph I can see this, but the rest of the literature is ignored. But you can't draw a balanced conclusion on just one thing that you've quoted. You're going to have to go back and look at the rest of it. And if you're only agreeing on 1/5 of your literature review, chances are you can't conclude that you agree overall, but candidates will still write that. That's what I mean by go back, check it, and then use that balanced approach to look at your data analysis. Evaluating your study. By evaluating your study, you're looking at everything you've done overall. You're taking a step back from it and you're going, right, here's what did I think. So think about how reliable things are. How reliable is your analysis? How reliable is your data collection? How significant are your results? The validity of your study. So think about actually, does it contribute to any sort of geographical thinking? How important is it? Is it significant? Your limitations. How limited were you on time, for example? Resources. Could you actually evaluate your title? Did you have enough time to do certain things? Did you have enough data, for example, to draw conclusions? All good points to make here. Sort of 2-3 paragraphs maximum there, I would suggest. And once you've done all of that, you're looking to sort of wrap up your investigation. If you're wrapping up your investigation, you're going to do one big final overall conclusion. You're going to think about stakeholders. So stakeholders, someone's got a view or an opinion on something. So who's going to be interested in what you've written? What would you do if you had a bit more time here? And then most importantly, because we do not plagiarise, is where we put in our list of references. So if you're thinking about improvements you're going to make, how could you extend your study? What might you change about your methodology? How is it really useful? How could you draw on this research? Have you got enough to actually justify your claim? So, for example, one improvement you could make is to say, actually, to decide whether it is valid within the geographical community, I should probably go back and look at ideas on X, Y, and Z in the literature, as this is one idea or one sort of concept that was thrown up quite a lot through the course of my data collection. With stakeholders, why are you finding significant? Who's going to be interested in them? If I'm investigating SUDs within the local area, who's going to be interested? Right, the Environment Agency, the local council, perhaps my local MP, particularly in the light of flooding. Those would be people that I would sort of explain away here. This doesn't need to be a massive section, about a paragraph would do it. Your conclusions, I think the easiest way to do those is to paste in your overall aims, conclude by aim or sub-question first, and then use all of that evidence to present a balanced final overall conclusion. I think this is really, really useful. Remember, this section is marked at a 15, so your conclusions need to be really well developed. It's not just enough to say, I agree, here's one piece of evidence, right, overall, yep, you can make that judgment. That's not going to put you in the top band of marks here, and is certainly not going to put you in level 4. After you've done all of this, it's your list of references. So again, this should be your full bibliography to reference any work that you've used. Normally we do this in the Harvard style, and it should be in alphabetical order by the author's surname. You'll see here on the screen some examples of how I've referenced things like journal articles, how I've done books, websites. Most important with a website is obviously to put the date the website was accessed at the end as well. You'll see I've done an example for each of these on the screen. Feel free to pause if you do need to. And then once you've finished it all, just edit it up, make sure this looks like a professional piece of work. It's worth 20% of your A-level, and you obviously want to put your best foot forward to the examiner and to the moderator. Here's where everything starts to go in your appendices. Appendices are like annexes, tagging things on at the back of your study that aren't necessarily used throughout, but people might want to refer to, and sort of jazzing it up a little bit. By sort of jazzing it up, I mean, have you put your blank copies of your data sheets at the back? Have you popped your data at the end of your study? Have you got a contents page? So if the moderator just wants to check area 4, for example, they can flick straight to that page. Have you numbered up your pages? You don't need to obviously put page numbers on the computer. You can write those on by hand. That's absolutely fine. At the start of your study, have you got an executive summary or an abstract? Think of this almost as like reading the back cover of a book you're about to buy. Think of it's not want to give away the answer, but you want to give like a brief overview of your study to get somebody interested in it. Well, I'm obviously at my favourite shop, Waterstones, and I'm looking at the back cover of every single book, deciding which one I'm going to purchase. I'm looking for some sort of hint about it, and I'm looking for something to get me excited about the geography. That's what we're after in your NEA here. Title page. Please choose suitable font and image. What I mean by that, again, I'll say it probably about till I'm blue in the face. Have you got an appropriate font size on there? So not font size 48, for example. If I'm doing an investigation about, I don't know, globalisation in Reading, it'd be appropriate if I had a picture of Reading High Street, for example. I wouldn't want an overview of the cityscape of London on my front cover. The two aren't linked, and therefore I wouldn't do it. Finally, the most important thing is package it all up and get it ready to go. So 1.5 space your text, so we can write in between the lines and annotate your work really clearly for the moderator. That's really important. Print things out in colour, so it's easy to see your maps and your graph. Print a copy out of your approved proposal to go in the front of your NEA, and pop it all in a plastic wallet. One final read through, check you're happy with it, and obviously go and drop it off to geography teacher. Remember, once you sign that form to say it's your own work, there's no going back, and you can't add or change anything to do with it, so make sure you're 100% happy before you give it in to geography teacher. As always, if you've got any questions, please shout or pop me an email. More than happy to help.